Right, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 9th webinar by SLS Select Education. I hope everyone's doing well. Today we're focusing on the topic of sustainability, which involves balancing environmental, social and economic considerations to ensure the long-term well-being of both the people and planet. Now, just quickly, I want to make sure everything's working properly. If you can see and hear me, please give a thumbs up or a yes in the chat, just so I know I'm not talking to myself.
Got some yeses.
Yes, okay, that's fine. I don't need yeses from everyone. As long as a few people saying yes, that's fine. We'll carry on. Thank you, Bennett. Presenting today, we have our own Lucy Moore. Lucy joined the company nearly 2 years ago as our sustainability manager to help us on our own sustainability journey, which you'll get to hear a little about later on. The presentation you're going to see is very similar to the presentation Lucy gave myself and the other sales managers to train us up on the subject. We found it very informative, and given the relevance and growing interest in sustainability, we thought it would be a good idea to offer it to our customer base, hence this webinar. Now, before we do get started, we need to go through the normal housekeeping and bits and bobs. Firstly, to ensure a good experience for everyone without background noise or distractions, all cameras and microphones have been disabled for the duration of the webinar, with the exception of mine and Lucy's. The chat box is available throughout, so if you do have any comments or questions, please feel free to drop it in there. I'll be monitoring the chat box while the presentation is happening and answering any questions I can. If we need to, we will ask Lucy to pause and address any pressing queries, but there will also be a dedicated Q&A session at the end, so if you can, just try and hold off till then. I think everyone joining us today is at work, so we're aware you might be disturbed by a student or a teacher at any given moment. So if you do need to leave early, or if the session ends and you suddenly think of a question, please contact your technical sales manager, or reps as we're otherwise known, and they'll get back to you as soon as possible. Hopefully everyone knows who their contact is, but if you don't know who your contact is, then send me an email. I'll forward it to the right person and ask them to contact you to introduce themselves and answer your question. Now, this webinar is being recorded. The recording has already started, and it will be made available on our YouTube channel along with all of our previous webinars. It's usually uploaded within about a week of the live event happening, and you can find it here. I'm just going to put our YouTube channel into the chat. So we don't upload a lot of content. The last upload we did was 2 or 3 months ago, which was a short 3-minute tour of our fancy new warehouse. And then before that, it was the chemical webinar we did with Chris Pambu at the start of the year, which we got a lot of good feedback about. Now, one final tip I'll give everyone is once Lucy starts presenting, she'll have a PowerPoint presentation. So on the top of the screen, you'll see some options. View, if you click on view, once the presentation is being shared, you can click on focus on content. It'll be grayed out at the moment because there's no presentation being shared, but if you click on that, once Lucy starts, it will just make it a little bit easier to see the slides as she's going through them. So without further ado, we'll get started with today's session. So I'm going to turn off my camera and microphone now and monitor the chat box. But I will be here and I'll suddenly reappear at the end for the Q&A session. So enjoy the webinar, everybody, and over to you, Lucy.
Amazing. Thanks, Gary. Hi, everybody. I'm Lucy, as has been explained already. So I'm just going to share my slides and we'll get right into it. Give me just one sec. I'm going to do the classic thing of saying, can everybody see my screen? Can everybody see that? Gary, if you're able to just say, yeah, everybody can see.
Yes, I can see, and we're getting a few yeses in the chat as well.
Amazing, good. Always has to be asked, but yeah, still cringe every time you do ask it. So basically today I'm going to go through a few different things. It's kind of just like a whistle-stop tour of sustainability, if you will. And at the end, it's going to kind of come into a little bit around lab product sustainability and determining that. So I've kind of just put a little bit of a brief agenda on like net zero, science-based targets, carbon reduction, what scope emissions are, ESG, CSR, some buzzwords you might have already heard, and then go into determining product sustainability at the end, which will kind of relate back to what we do at SLS as well. So just kind of like housekeeping of my own, I suppose. I want this to be somewhat of an interactive session. It's not necessarily all just a lecture. So as much as you can use the chat, that'd be great, because I'll be probably asking you guys questions, but also be forthcoming with any comments, questions, and take any opportunities you can to share your own knowledge wherever relevant, if you want to, in the chat as well. So I'm sure Gary will be kind of on in the chats and things as well, because as soon as I share my screen, I can't necessarily see the chat. So there might be a few questions I ask, and it'd be good to see any comments coming through. So without further ado, we're going to go on to net zero and science-based targets. So my first question to you guys in the chat, to get everyone's brains working on a Wednesday afternoon, is, can anybody tell me what net zero means? Have you heard net zero before, and just the general terminology around it? I'm going to rely on you, Gary, to see if there's anybody coming through in the chat to say, yes, I've not heard of it. No, I haven't.
It would help if I had my microphone on, wouldn't it? But yes, getting a few yeses from people saying they've heard of it before.
Yep, amazing. So in terms of net zero, what it means is essentially a balance between the good and the bad. If we're talking very, very high level terms, you might have heard terms like net zero carbon, or carbon neutral, or net zero, or climate neutral. It essentially means that we're balancing out the greenhouse gas emissions that we're emitting by doing other activity, whether it's kind of avoidance or removal. So we're kind of leveling out. We're not kind of causing more bad than good, kind of thing. So that's what it generally means. It doesn't mean that we're not emitting any carbon emissions whatsoever. It's just the same as like your gross and net income, if you think about it that way, essentially. There isn't another piece of terminology that is carbon negative or climate positive. So that's a lot more of a regenerative route, which kind of is very much more, yes, we've got the net zero balance, but let's go further and add more positive things than what's happening in a negative way. So just covering that kind of level of terminology first. And in terms of how net zero is often measured, we talk about carbon, we're talking about carbon emissions, carbon reduction plans, and everything like that. This is the general like metric of how we measure carbon just generally. So it's in metric tons of CO2, carbon dioxide equivalent. So you might have seen this when anybody's talking about carbon reduction plans, or like the metrics that they provide and stuff. That's just the measure of it, basically. So all greenhouse gases are measured in this way, which is why you've got like the equivalent. So everything is equivalent to what it would be if it was carbon dioxide, rather than having, there's 11 greenhouse gases, I think, off the top of my head, and rather than measuring them all, we measure them in carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so moving on swiftly to science-based targets and aligning with climate science. These are probably terms that you've come across just potentially in conversation or in the news, or reading Harvard Business Review, if you go that far. But what do they actually mean? What do science-based targets mean, or what does it mean to align with climate science? So can anybody tell me in the chat what that is? Has anybody heard of it before, or can explain it potentially? Gary, I'm going to rely on you having eyes on the chat.
No one's messaged in yet, so it might be new information.
Yeah, maybe we just get straight into it then.
Yeah.
So essentially, we can probably all agree, hopefully, that we're in a bit difficult spot when it comes to the health of the planet. And because of that, there was a climate change conference that happened in 2015, which was COP21. I think we're at COP something now, but basically in Paris in 2015, world leaders got together and decided we need to find a solution for climate change and what it's going to do to the planet, essentially, because it's looking like it's degrading at the minute and deteriorating. And what they came up with was the Paris Agreement. Some people might have heard of the Paris Agreement, but basically the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals came out of this initial chat. And the Paris Agreement is basically to hold the increase of global average temperature rising to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, but pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So you might have heard people talk about the 1.5 scenario. That's basically what that is. It's aligning to the Paris Agreement, and I think 91 countries or 96 countries have signed this agreement. The reason for the clumsy wording is because originally they settled on 2 degrees, but then there are a few island nations that basically had got the stats to say, oh, actually at 2 degrees we're going to be underwater, so maybe can we make it 1.5 degrees? And then that's the best chance for everybody and all nations to have a greener future at that 1.5 scenario. So any kind of carbon reduction plan and net zero plans and things have to really try to align to that 1.5 scenario. And so the timeline for that 1.5 scenario is basically by the end of this century, so 2100, I suppose, we want to have not kind of surpassed that boundary. And to not surpass that boundary, we need to be net zero by 2050 across all emissions across the globe. But to achieve the net zero by 2050, we need to roughly halve emissions by 2030, which isn't that far away. And that's why the 2020 to 2030 was coined the decade of action, because to go from business as usual to halving emissions in what's now going to be 6 years, probably closing in on 5 years, is kind of where the action needs to take place, hence the urgency around having sustainability policies and carbon reduction plans, and actually not just relying on kind of offsetting and things, but people actually decarbonising their fleets and things like that, and carbon reduction within labs and single-use plastics. And this is the kind of level of urgency and the why behind it, I suppose. So moving on to carbon reduction and scope emissions, how does this relate to businesses like emissions? How do we measure a business's emissions? Can anybody answer in the chat how a company's emissions are usually measured in terms of, I'm trying not to say the word, like holistically? What does that look like? Has anybody got any terminology or things that they've heard or measure themselves?
You got a couple of responses, couple of no's. Someone said transport and packaging costs. Another one said about the carbon footprint or carbon budget question mark. Yep. So there's a few ideas.
Amazing, yeah. They're all very relevant to what I'm going to show in a sec. So this diagram basically covers all the carbon emissions and carbon budget, I suppose, in a way too, of what a business looks like from a quantitative perspective. We're talking about quantitative measures. So how you calculate and determine a company's sustainability is through 3 different scopes of carbon emissions equivalents. You've got your scope 1, which is in the arrow in the middle pointing up, which is basically everything that a company does operationally. So when it comes to its facilities or its company vehicles that it's owned. So for a company such as SLS, it would be, what does it cost in terms of carbon for our facility to run? Do we have like generators and things like that? Are we running things on gas? We're not anymore at the Fareham facility, if you visited. Do we have any company vehicles that we own? And what kind of fuels do they use? And the carbon emissions of that. So that's kind of scope 1 is very much more, you can think of it in terms of like your operational emissions and quantifying what that looks like. Scope 2 is essentially your purchased electricity and energy. So that's very much relying on if you're sourcing renewable energy, or a fraction of renewable energy proportion of your energy comes from solar, hydro, nuclear, or whether it comes from fossil fuels. So it's basically your electricity contracts and things like that that come under your scope 2. And then scope 3, which even though it's the third, you might think it's the smallest. Scope 3 actually, as you can see from the 15 different categories, represents all of the carbon emissions that come from the entire value chain of a company. So that goes all the way upstream, purchased goods and services, any capital goods that have been bought, transportation and distribution upstream, any waste generated, any travel, commuting, assets and stuff. Downstream, that's obviously any processing of sold products, if that's applicable to your company. Downstream distribution, end of life use of sold products, franchises, investments, any kind of thing that can has the ability to emit carbon in upstream or downstream that's not related directly to the company's operations is what we call scope 3. And as you can imagine, the scope 3 with the 15 different categories is often the hardest to actually measure. Which is why if you've got a company that is scope 1, 2, 3 accountable, that's a good thing. So for a company like SLS, as a distributor, one of the main areas of carbon intensity is our scope 3, because we buy to sell. And of the 15 different categories in scope 3, it's our purchased goods and services, which is the most carbon intensive area and category for us. That's often the case for quite a few different businesses. If you think about any kind of retailer, Tesco, Morrison's, Amazon, anything like that, it will be in their purchased goods and services that the majority of the impact will come from, in terms of going all the way down the supply chain to what's the carbon impact of getting this raw material out of the ground to make something and then build something new and send it across the world to different places in the global supply chain to get it into everybody's labs, homes, whatever. So that's generally, in a whistle-stop tour, how you look at a business's emissions. And in terms of calculating emissions, particularly from a purchased goods and services perspective and a product sustainability perspective, although we'll come on to that a little bit later, there are different levels of data integrity there. So for the vast majority of people calculating their scope 3, their value chain emissions, they will often rely on how much have we spent each year, and on what? Have we spent a lot on business travel and hotels and hospitality? Have we spent a lot on the product that we bring in? Have we spent a lot on upstream distribution or downstream distribution or services and things like that? And they will work out their emissions based on a rough global emissions factor for that activity based on how much they've spent. You can probably already understand there are some downsides of doing that, because obviously if you grow as a company, you'll probably spend more, you'll probably have more people, and therefore if you've got spend directly correlating to emissions, if you spend more, then your emissions will go up. So in terms of a carbon reduction plan, it's better to have a higher data integrity for your carbon and scope emissions, which is why you've got kind of things like average data, which is built on, okay, we've bought X amount of units or X amount of weight of stuff, or done X amount of hotel stays rather than how much we spent on a hotel, things like that. And then you go into kind of like hybrid data and specific data, but just wanted to kind of demonstrate that there are different levels of how accurate your data can be when it comes to calculating emissions. And the easiest are the ones in orange, and the hardest to get are the ones in purple for suppliers. So it's kind of in different companies, and yeah, it can be, everybody has to calculate this kind of information to be able to report on their emissions, really. This is kind of like a very boring slide, but this is kind of lots of different ways that companies and organizations actually track their sustainability against different frameworks. There's a Science-Based Targets Initiative, the SBTi, which you may have heard of. There's the Sustainable Development Goals. Some companies track their progress against the different 17 goals that are there. There's a TPT, which is the transition of transition plan task force, which is very much aligned to kind of having carbon accountability, but also a carbon reduction plan and climate transition plan for the long term. There's a CDP, which is Carbon Disclosure Project. So these are all elements of company disclosure and transparency that they can get to. But for the vast majority of companies that we deal with, a lot is focused on alignment to science-based targets, so kind of like that 2050, 2030, and if you can make that based on realistic targets within your supply chain and your value chain and stuff, and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which come out of the Paris Agreement. Obviously, I realise that we've talked a lot about carbon emissions, but obviously sustainability is a lot more than just talking about carbon. It includes a lot of interconnected links and stuff like that. So it's not just sustainability is synonymous with a company's carbon emissions. From a business as an organizational perspective, there can be a lot more that goes into a sustainability strategy. So there can be things like inequality. You've got your diversity and inclusion policies and procedures and stuff like that, and what you're doing around inclusivity in your business, what you're doing about biodiversity, your water, health, different education, upskilling opportunities, things like that to address. So it's not just necessarily the quantifiable metrics. It's easy to kind of often rely on carbon emissions as kind of like the metric for sustainability because it's measurable and often then can seem a lot more tangible, but it's just important to understand there are a lot more things that come into the kind of umbrella of sustainability, which brings me on to CSR versus ESG. So I'm going to ask in the chat, has anybody heard of either of these? And can anybody tell me what the difference is of either of these? It's okay if nobody knows what they are or anything, but I'll come into it in a minute. Anything in the chat, Gary?
One person said no, and I have to say I never knew about these two before I had my training with Lucy either. So you're in good company. So yeah, we've had 4 no's so far. So please carry on, Lucy.
Okay, so CSR is might ring a few bells if I start talking about it. CSR is corporate social responsibility, and ESG is environmental social governance. I'll come on to what they are in a minute, but they do have different meanings and scopes in a sense, but they both come under the umbrella, which is why there's umbrella there, of sustainability. So there's a nice little table that I'm going to come up with in a minute, which is explaining the differences between CSR and ESG. So CSR and ESG are both ways to demonstrate a commitment to sustainable business practices or sustainable practices within your organization, just as having a sustainability policy is. Both are same in that respect. However, CSR, or corporate social responsibility, is a lot more of a idealistic kind of qualitative measure put on sustainability, rather than your kind of more quantitative carbon metrics reporting, data-driven sustainability and reporting and governance there, I suppose. Which is why ESG has much more of a smaller scope. There are certain things that companies report on in their sustainability reports, kind of like your waste figures, your carbon metrics, things that can be tangibly measured. Whereas CSR, whilst it can still be measured in some respects, it often has a much more of a broad, that qualitative aspect to it. And it's often self-regulated as opposed to when we think back to the slide with all the different frameworks on, a lot of ESG is kind of externally regulated. So you might sign up to a different framework or get your carbon reduction plan targets validated by an external body like the SBTi, for example. Sustainability is both of these kind of combined, which I'll come on to in a little bit as to the combination of things. And CSR is not necessarily directly related to business valuation in a way that ESG can be. If you're kind of talking investors and things like that, investors want to see ESG reports and metrics to be able to value a business in a sense, and that comes up from a tender perspective as well. But CSR is very much kind of like implemented through your kind of your values in a sense, and your brand and what you think of when you think of a brand, or yeah, your kind of internal culture and things like that, and the initiatives that you have in place internally to kind of do better, really. A lot of ESG is kind of like much more implemented through data-driven sustainability is how I would kind of coin it in a sense, which is like your measurable goals and having audits and making sure there's compliance there across the board. And sustainability as a whole brings both the kind of qualitative CSR initiatives and culture alongside those data-driven metrics for ESG. And basically, a business needs both ESG and CSR in order to be more like fully sustainable, but CSR is often a precursor to being able to get those quantifiable metrics. So you might start out with a CSR strategy and different initiatives potentially, which then evolve into, oh, actually we could measure this and actually report this and kind of align to some external frameworks potentially, and put set KPIs and stuff, and be audited on it. So that's the kind of difference between CSR and ESG. Both are kind of needed and valid from a sustainability conversation perspective, but it will depend on often the type of company or organization, but also what kind of, I suppose, legislation is in place for your industry, and also if you've got investors, what their expectations are, and what they put on you in terms of expectations, really. So it really depends. But from my opinion, it is very much a combination of CSR and ESG that works best. You've got like the culture, you embedding the culture and the values into a business, and it's kind of like something that people live and breathe, but also you need the kind of data-driven stuff to actually be able to track where you are when it comes to things like carbon reduction, waste management, water stewardship, stuff like that. So we come on to product sustainability now. So in terms of product sustainability, it's often quite difficult to determine what a sustainable product looks like, or a more sustainable product looks like. Can anybody tell me, or just kind of maybe try to define in the chat what they think a sustainable product looks like, or qualities that it, or characteristics that it has? I'm going to rely on Gary again for the chat.
That's fine. I'm just giving them a minute because it might take them a little bit of time to write out.
To have a think, yeah. What does it mean for a product to be sustainable? Is it possible for a product to be sustainable?
Jackie's come in saying reusable.
Reusable, yeah, that would be a quality of a more sustainable product, because you've got that kind of durability argument.
I think I like Joanna's response. Minimal environmental impact in production, minimal waste, possible to recycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, a few other ideas coming from other people as well, like low or neutral carbon footprint. Again, recycled materials, or comes from a renewable source. I think they're all pretty good.
These are all very, very valid. Yeah. So I'll come into it a little bit. So if you think about the kind of CSR, the qualitative versus the quantitative, just keep that in mind when we're talking about product sustainability. So in terms of the ideal scenario, if you're in a purchasing role, it would be great. I know it would be great for me if every single product that you were looking at in a catalogue had a full life cycle assessment, which is basically the calculation of carbon right from raw material to like end of life of products, that goes through like lots of different probably manufacturers for different components, the kind of final assembly and distribution, like the manufacture and distribution, the packaging, the use, right until when it kind of either gets recycled or goes to landfill or has a new life maybe as well. That's what a full life cycle assessment means. It's a very comprehensive process, but it would be ideal if each individual product had a carbon metric associated with it, so you could actually understand maybe some more quantitative metrics of its environmental impact. So you could say this has got X amount of carbon associated with its entire life as a product. So then you could actually, in the ideal world, which is why I've got the kind of like rainbow unicorn scenario picture, it would be very cool, I'm sure Gary would agree as well, to be able to have direct comparisons being able to be made between quantitative carbon impact, environmental impact, and price. So you could see, oh, would I pay like maybe 20p more for something that has a less carbon impact than this one, kind of thing? That would be great if we had that level of information. But as I'm going to explain, the reality is that this level of detail for product data isn't always readily available, particularly in the context of our industry, because this information has to come from down the supply chain. There's a level of supply chain mapping that has to occur in data collection all the way down to raw material and what kind of energy or is used in extracting the raw material, what kind of tools are used in manufacture, what kind of facilities and what they run on, are all incorporated into even just a single product sustainability. So how do we actually understand or better understand how sustainable a product is when it's right from raw material, manufacture, packaging, distribution, use in the lab, and then back out again? And often when we talk about sustainability of products, this is normally where the focus is, in the use and the end of life stages. But as you can see from this diagram, there's a lot more to the picture. And I think some of the people in the comments have said, oh, it has to be from has to be more sustainable in terms of the materials it's using and stuff like that, which is basically at the start of its life. So just a bit of terminology. When we're talking about life cycle assessments and understanding the carbon impact of different products, which we might be far away from, it's good to know what the terms are. But basically, if you want to understand the carbon metrics between raw material in the ground of all the different components and stuff, or one component depending on your product, all the way to when it gets to the factory gates, that's called cradle to gate metrics, carbon metrics. And then when we're talking raw material right until it's being used and being thrown away or recycled or repurposed, it's called cradle to grave. So grave would probably be more your landfill scenarios, and cradle to cradle would be if it's got a more of a closed loop circularity in the product, and less of a linear life cycle. And that would be carbon metrics from right to the raw material, end of life, and also what it would take for it to become a new raw material. So that's just basically just things to consider when you're thinking about product sustainability. In a sense, it's not just, is it energy efficient when I turn it on, and can I throw it away well? They're not just the exclusive arguments that you would want to consider when talking about or thinking about how can I be more sustainable in a lab, for example. So the thing is, determining product sustainability, as I've kind of mentioned, because of like the difference in what would be ideal and the reality, can be difficult because it's quite a complex process if you think about that whole life cycle of a product. And currently there are lots of different approaches about to do with how more sustainable products are marketed. I'm sure in the chat people probably can say, yes, I've seen green leaves, I've seen eco-friendly, I've seen 10 out of 10, I've seen different scoring systems and stuff, or I've seen just the color green on different products. And that can often kind of mean that even though it's quite a complex thing to have to determine, it's often quite easy to embrace green or eco-friendly or sustainable icons or narratives, because they're there in front of you and telling you this is a great product, but then you're not necessarily sure why they deserve this eco status unless you've got a little bit more granular information. So for example, if you just saw a test tube that had a green leaf on it, that wouldn't really tell you anything about this life cycle or anything like that. Basically, you would kind of be questioning, yes, somebody said it's a better product because it's greener, but I don't really know how. And I understand wanting to kind of embrace the kind of eco-friendly or the leaves and things like that. But if it doesn't necessarily help you understand how it can align to any kind of or inform any lab sustainability strategies or organizational sustainability strategies, does it necessarily have longevity in how it can help you be more sustainable as an organization or a lab or an individual even as well? So the different current approaches in the market, which some of you might already recognize, you've got your kind of green eco labels, whack a green stamp on it, which I've already kind of gone into, but then that begs the question of like, well, why is it greener? Why is it a more sustainable option? Where's the transparency at product level to kind of explain the reasoning behind this eco label? Because obviously it can be very much a blanket statement and can often be prone to greenwashing. Greenwashing in a sense is kind of not always malicious from a marketing team. It can just be overzealous marketeers wanting to sell something in the best way, and they might call something eco-friendly, but then if you think about the term eco-friendly, what does it actually mean? What's the kind of I suppose tangible definition of something being entirely eco-friendly? Is anything entirely eco-friendly? And then you've got different scoring systems which are out there. I think there are a few within our market, but unless the problem with these is there are some laudable systems out there, but unless you have the same system across all products and using the same approach, it can often mean that you can't actually make comparisons between two products that might be using different scoring systems that might not even necessarily rely on carbon data to create a score for the product. It could be relying on subjective or qualitative information to create a score, and it's kind of like, it does beg the question often as to what's the algorithm or the calculation behind that score, especially if it's not kind of ubiquitous across the market. So they are very good in terms of understanding different impacts of products if everybody's using the same scoring system. There's also the full life cycle assessment, which we've gone into, which is the ideal scenario. However, the full life cycle assessment is not always, I think I know of maybe three life cycle assessments that have been completed for a product. It is often quite time and resource expensive, quite a big financial burden for a manufacturer to have to undergo to be able to get that level of data and that granularity of data to be able to communicate with customers and the market in general. So it's kind of like on the horizon, and we hope that that's the way that things are going. But it's kind of like, how do we actually understand or determine product sustainability in the interim? Well, we've at SLS tried to kind of cut through the noise a little bit by trying to give a little bit more information about product sustainability, not to the level of a full life cycle assessment, but encouraging, even whilst we are relying on qualitative information, but that qualitative information to actually be related to as much of the product life cycle as it can via different attributes. So we want, with the aim of the attributes that we've got, which you might have seen potentially in some of our catalogs or brochures, to provide as much information and product level transparency as we can to enable customers in labs and end users in procurement to actually make the most well-informed decisions possible. So our sustainability attributes are specific to individual products. So it's not just a case of it's got this award or it's got a green leaf here, and that green leaf could mean anything from this table on this different page, and you've got to kind of guess which one it could be. They're all very specific to the individual products. They are evidence-based, using primary data from suppliers. So we've actually been engaging our suppliers. This is an ongoing engagement piece to actually understand at product level, not just supplier and the organizational level of the supplier, what kind of is happening in the manufacture of the raw material. Are there any things that are being done from a resource efficiency perspective or renewable energy perspective further up the supply chain to make this product better? And we aim to include as much information about the product life cycle as possible and where the data is available. So our attributes cover the raw material, manufacture, packaging, distribution, use, end of life, and across those 5 different stages of the product life cycle, we've got 19 different qualitative attributes as little sub-criterias. So these range from, if you think about raw material, has a product been designed to reduce the use of raw materials? So if you've got a pipette, for example, has the new model of the pipette been designed in a way by the product designers to reduce the amount of plastic, because it got 13% less plastic than the previous model, for example. That data would be captured within the attributes, and it would score a point, well, not a point, but like it would get a raw material award, and you would see on the actual sustainability tab of the product, this product has been designed to reduce the use of raw materials. Or from a manufacturing point of view, has it been made in a facility that runs on renewable energy, or have there been measures in place during the manufacture that actually are kind of more conservative when it comes to resources used when it's being manufactured? Or is it manufactured in the UK or Ireland, or a country of origin that has a better environmental performance index, i.e. the country probably runs on mostly renewables as opposed to coal or gas or oil? And then the use, does it contribute to reduce water or reduce energy? Yes, energy efficiency in terms of like equipment is still part of what makes a product more sustainable, but it's not the kind of be all and end all kind of attribute, which is why it kind of we try to encompass as much as we can in terms of attributes across the whole life cycle. So you can have a look at this, but they're the products are represented in our kind of catalogs and brochures and things like that. But what I just wanted to kind of stress as well is with the attributes, you're kind of not kind of as I forgot the word, but there's not any kind of rainbow unicorn rhetoric is what my terminology is. Often people internally say, what are you on about when you talk about rainbow unicorn rhetoric? But it's kind of like the too good to be true argument. And if somebody's trying to sell you like something that sounds too good to be true, like, oh my God, it's like the greenest thing ever, it's 100% sustainable, it's the best, like most eco-friendly product on the planet, take it with a little bit like a pinch of salt, I suppose, and ask questions that relate to the product life cycle is what my advice would be on that. And avoid any, and I suppose in doing so, that would help you avoid any kind of umbrella marketing statements or vague statements about, or absolute statements about the sustainability or greenness of a product. And we also try to avoid the scoring systems which don't enable any kind of comparison or factual insight into the product life cycle. Yes, a score is great if you can compare between two different products, but if it also, the score doesn't necessarily provide you with anything to align to in terms of a strategy in place or wanting to prioritize a project around packaging, for example, a scoring doesn't necessarily help you that much to be able to do that. And also something that often happens within the market is that when more sustainable products are marketed, they can often focus on calling something sustainable in absolute terms when actually it's only one specific aspect or feature of a product that makes it a little bit more sustainable. So i.e. just one attribute. Just because something has got one attribute across this criteria that we've got doesn't make it an absolute 100% sustainable product. That's what I'm trying to explain. And that's it. In a very whistle-stop tour way, I think we've got some time now, about 15 minutes for questions or so. So I'll stop sharing and I'll let anybody ask any questions in the chat or shout up or however we want to do it, Gary.
Thank you very much, Lucy. It's quite good hearing that twice. It was a refresher course to me.
You're so clued up now.
Yeah, no, some of the slides, like the one when you were saying about the raw materials and stuff, as soon as I saw that, I just thought of Tesla, because I know everyone's electric cars are the way to go. They're amazing. And I heard this other side, which is the raw materials, mining them is a real harm to the environment. So
yeah, I think it's an interesting one because it's kind of like trying to find things wrong with things that are trying to do the better thing, but it's still at the same time it does highlight the importance of understanding more about the whole life cycle of something. Yes, it's zero emissions in the use perspective of things and that stage of its life cycle, but it's like, where did that come from to be able to get to that point? Where did all the metal come from? Where did the rubber, where did the lithium for the batteries and stuff, like you say?
Had someone sent a question in, are you planning on releasing a green catalogue which showcases your more sustainable products? Have we thought about that, or?
I don't know actually. I feel as if like the catalogs which you already have from SE perspective do incorporate the attributes, so you'll be able to see the ones that have got attributes already, and it's part of our kind of internal KPIs to strengthen the relationships that we've got with suppliers to provide much more data and get more and more products represented in the attribute scheme. I think at the minute we've got about 15,000 products represented to some degree in the program. And it's just one of our aims to get more and more products represented, so it would be part of the norm, essentially. I think something about sustainability which is important is trying to embed it into the business as usual, and I think having a separate catalogue to do that, once that, obviously that's on one side is more paper as well, but like having a separate catalogue, let's combine it into business as usual and change and like that, have that behavior change, and so people can see it in their day-to-day lives, I suppose, would be my argument there. But
I
to
can't
be available.
see us producing a catalogue like you said, but we'll possibly have some kind of mail out highlighting certain green products. When Lucy says 15,000 products, by the way, Lucy works on both the education catalogue and the industrial catalogue, so it's not 15,000 education products. I mean, because the industrial catalogue works a lot with universities. I think we first hired Lucy because a lot of the university tenders and frameworks did ask a lot of sustainability questions, which no one at the company knew how to answer properly. So we had to hire someone who knew what they were talking about. Another question's come in. How much as a purchaser are you able to influence the manufacturer about their sustainability?
This is this is my day-to-day qualm, I suppose. In terms of like the ability to influence, I think there has to be that level of collaboration there, and I think that's something that SLS are really good at, in terms of just having those checkups and those kind of due diligence initiatives in place, and it's something that we incorporate quite a bit into kind of supplier reviews and stuff, and what do you do? And we basically track, what are you doing year on year to do this? How much packaging are you sending to SLS? And obviously once you measure something or are able to measure something, and we're trying to kind of like nurture suppliers to be able to give those kind of measurements. But once you measure it, you're able to actually, I'm a firm believer in, if you measure it, you can reduce it kind of thing. But it's something that I think, even though it's, I suppose, indirect emissions and indirect impact from our supply chain, it's something that as a distributor we do have the responsibility to collaborate with suppliers and nurture and educate our supply chain to be able to provide more innovative solutions or identify kind of new opportunities or potential risks and things like that. So I think when it comes to packaging, it's often a difficult one because it's something that we don't necessarily have direct control over, but we do what we can to try and influence that. Obviously, that's dependent on the type of products that you're getting. If you get something that needs to be protected, it will often come in a fair bit more packaging, just to ensure the quality of the product actually gets to you in one piece. So, for example, if you're buying glass test tubes and stuff, you're probably not going to send it just as like a whole bunch of them in a big cardboard box and just hope for the best. They're going to be like wrapped a little bit better. So it is dependent on the types of products that you're buying as well. From a packaging perspective, I can say that buying in bulk can often be better. But yeah, it's something that which we're taking on board and trying to educate and nurture our supply chain to progress towards getting more and better packaging solutions.
I mean, I think it's fair to say every supplier is going to be different. I mean, we work with a lot of suppliers. If we are the supplier's biggest customer, they will probably listen to everything we say and do whatever they can to keep us happy. But if it's a multi-million-pound company and we are a very small customer of theirs, they may ignore some of our emails, we'll say. So it will vary a lot from supplier to supplier.
Yeah, so that's where our supplier engagement initiatives come into play, and having that relationship with suppliers, I think, and having those strong partnerships can really affect the level of influence we have in the market, I think, as well. And obviously we as a distributor have that kind of advantage in a sense where we're talking to customers and we're talking to manufacturers, and we can say, this is customer expectations, let's try to meet them.
Yeah, and if every company's going the same way we are, asking these questions, if they're getting the same question from lots of their customers, they will address it. It'd be silly for them not to address it. A few more questions come in. I think you may have covered this partly. How much is SLS doing to reduce packaging? Because sometimes deliveries seem to have an excess amount of packaging. And what about combined shipping to reduce transport? I think we already do combined shipping to reduce our transport emissions.
Yeah, I think might have covered a little bit on the packaging there. In terms of like the shipping side of things, a lot can be helped from, whilst we do have our carbon reduction plan in place, which does feature a kind of a gradual migration of our fleet towards low emissions and zero emissions vehicles by 2030. That's something which we're working to operationally, but I think in terms of the van efficiency side of things, we do have very efficient van runs that are designed for customers, and we try to be very efficient with the fuel that our drivers are using as well. And our drivers are even trained to use less fuel a lot of the time. So that's something that which is in the interim, something that we're very conscious of. But also in terms of how we can collaborate with customers, I think it's important to recognise that there's also an opportunity there if you're kind of looking at consolidated shipments and potentially things like standing orders, or understanding what your yearly allowance of things is that you need, and maybe looking at kind of the frequency of deliveries that you were able to deliver, and not necessarily having that Amazon Prime I suppose perspective on click, and then our system's already done it and sent it away, and then you I should have got that as well, and then it's another click and it's another order. So I think there is some element of collaboration that could happen potentially more there, and there is opportunity to do that. To think it's not just us and suppliers, it can be also what can we do to help you kind of combine and consolidate from an inventory perspective as well. So there are less deliveries and there's less vans out there, just generally.
And packaging wise, we get it a lot. We get some people saying too much packaging, other people saying my stuff was broken, there wasn't enough packaging. It's a fine line, and we try and get it. We try and get it right. Obviously, test tube speakers, we know they need more packaging. We don't want things to arrive broken. Are sustainable products more expensive? I think I know the answer to that.
This always comes up. And you can say that some more sustainable products can be more expensive, yes. So for example, if you've brought as a manufacturer a brand new supply chain, new raw material that you're testing out for a tube or something, that's obviously an investment that the manufacturer has made that then there will be cost in the value chain, and that cost has to balance out itself in some way. However, I think it's not always a trade-off in my perspective. Yes, sustainability is an investment, and I believe that companies should see sustainability as investment and a way to future-proof themselves. Organizations, schools, everything can future-proof themselves from that sustainability perspective. It's becoming the business as usual, even to so much as like new legislation coming into place around it. It is an investment that you have to make sooner rather than later, in my opinion. However, there is the other side of things where it's not always a trade-off, because if you've got a product that has used, say, less raw material, or has produced less waste in its supply chain, it might not be made of like the new innovative material, but there are resource efficiency measures in place that means the manufacturer is actually using less material, it's using less energy, it's using less water, producing less waste because of the way that they're actually innovating within their manufacturing and sourcing down the supply chain. That can mean that there's less that they're spending on things. So then it doesn't actually mean that the most sustainable option is always the most expensive. It can be that a very resource efficient product that's made in a very good, efficient way because the supplier has put and the manufacturer has put emphasis on the efficiency of its own supply chain. It can mean that it's actually not a very expensive product, but it still has the same kind of qualities and attributes that you kind of very well branded, like this is the new thing, kind of more sustainable product might have. So that's the kind of where it's important to kind of look at what's happening in the supply chain and look further upstream for things that could help in terms of what is a manufacturer doing to save on resource, and therefore that could also translate into a cheaper product. I was going to say more expensive, but yeah, the cheaper product. Yeah.
And yeah, it won't always be more expensive. I mean, I say to something everyone has in their home is a fridge freezer, and everyone knows you can buy a very cheap one, energy rating E or something like that, and over the year or over 2 years, you'll spend more on electricity than buying the energy rated number A. So yeah, that's one thing to think
The
about.
investment side of things, yeah.
Yeah, and actually now he's mentioned energy, just to give an example quickly, if I can share my screen. Oh, I've got so many windows open, it's going to be nice and difficult. Okay, I think this will share it. Oh, I'm not showing a video. Everyone see the catalog? Can you see it, Lucy?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So on the left-hand side here, we have a water still, which is what nearly every school and college has at the moment, for making their distilled water. And on the right-hand side, we have a water purification system. It's much more expensive initially. I mean, the price there, I think, is just under £4,000. But and this table was made a couple of years ago. Here it goes through the difference in the power consumption and how much that both will be costing you on electricity each year. So I mean, this type of product over here, I wouldn't expect schools and colleges to buy out their usual science budget. It would probably be more or less your entire science budget for a lot of people. But if you let the site manager know, or if there's someone at the school who's interested in saving energy and lowering bills, then you can show them this and say over the course of a year or 2 years, we'll get our money back in what we save in energy. Yeah, so I'll stop sharing now.
That was a good example of just different ways to look at it, I suppose. The durability argument as well comes into it. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was I saw Donna O'Connor, if anyone's monitoring the chat as well, is our technical support lady. So I just noticed her message and it reminded me. Oh, sorry, and that she's put something else in there as well. Let me share. I'll share one more time. And on our website now. Okay. Yeah, for some products like this one, which I was just talking about, at the bottom here we've got a lot of tabs. Sometimes it'll be documents, which is normally where you find user manuals and things like that. Specifications tab. There's a new tab called sustainability.
Yep.
Not everything will have it, but like this product, for example, does have a sustainability tab.
And they're the specific ones to the product. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, we are adding this sort of information online as and when we get it. We had a question come in just before Donna's comment now, and I know the answer to this question, but I'll let you answer it, Lucy. Do you audit your supplier sustainability claims or take them at their word? How easy is it to do?
This is something that, like, from a product sustainability perspective, the attributes that we just went through, we get that information from suppliers, and obviously it goes through our product information management team, our PIM team, and often we will kind of go back with any questions that we've got to kind of clarify and make sure that it is actually evidence-based and the supplier has got that level of information they can say and kind of validate their claims. So we do kind of vet and screen that from a product sustainability perspective to make sure that customers are getting the right information. From an organizational perspective, we do look at supplier assessment and data collection on a yearly basis at supplier organizational level. So that's something that we do in conjunction with review meetings and stuff. So that collects data on an annual basis around modern slavery, conflict minerals and things like that, social value. But from an audit perspective, where we kind of will do audits is when we can see a risk essentially in our supply chain. That will be highlighted as a hotspot, and we'll kind of want to understand more about that essentially. So a lot of it is taken on their word, and there's different accreditations and schemes and stuff that they can be part of to get like the validation and certifications and stuff from an organizational perspective, like EcoVadis and ISO certifications and things like that, that you have to have a certificate for, so it's a lot easier to vet, but a lot of it is based on that kind of trustworthy partnership with suppliers as well.
Yeah, so we don't work with just anybody. We try and actually have a relationship with our suppliers and contacts and things like that. Another question came in. The biggest single contributor to our total carbon footprint is commuting. What is SLS doing to reduce their carbon emission with staff commuting, and have you got any tips?
So actually, staff commuting from a Scope 3 perspective, in terms of those 15 categories, isn't a huge amount comparatively to what we our purchase goods and services and capital goods from the new build and stuff for this year, but it is something which obviously the new building does help facilitate with. We have EV charging stations, we have bike shelters and stuff, but also we're only like a couple of minutes from the local tram stop, so local commuting is far easier as well. I think as well we have adopted the hybrid kind of working model, and we have a lot of kind of remote workers as well. So that does help from a commuting perspective. But then we've also got the business travel side of things as well. But we have a new business and travel kind of policy in place, which does cover and encourages good environmental practice and highlights the difference between, say, flying economy or flying business, or having a smart car versus a kind of Range Rover Sport and stuff, to kind of educate, I think. And that's the kind of purpose of trying to kind of have these kind of policies. It does require that level of education within the business so people can understand, oh, I didn't know that had like 4 times more carbon emissions than going this. I could probably do that because I could just get the bus for £2, or well, nowadays it's probably like £4 or £5, but but yeah, it is around like the education and nurturing of like what the kind of business as usual culture is, and it has to be embedded into the culture of the organization. But that is its own feat in itself, I think, sometimes. So so yeah, I would just encourage like the communication about it. Starting the conversation is often the first place and the best place to go and have that journey and make progress on it. So yeah.
I think awareness is the first step in most things, isn't it? Is being aware and then trying to solve it afterwards. Well done to Sarah. I know you just typed in your college has started supporting the Cycle to Work scheme. That's a good thing.
Amazing, yeah.
Hope it doesn't rain too much for all you guys cycling in. We're getting a lot of people now saying thank you. They've really enjoyed it, and I think the school bell's gone, so a lot of them are dropping off and shooting off now. Now, once again, I'd like to say thank you to Lucy. It's been a really good session, and it's not easy presenting when you can't sort of see or hear anyone. But I thought it went really well.
I'd love to meet everybody in person, but yeah, sometimes it's not always logistically possible. But yeah,
I am tempted to leave cameras and mics on for one of these webinars, but I think it'd be chaos and I'd regret it. So everyone was here to listen to you today, and I think they all got a very informative speech, which about an important topic as well.
Yeah.
So, and someone said about it being recorded. This has been recorded, and it will be loaded on our YouTube channel within the next week, say. And so you can share it, or you can view a bit you might have missed. Then, if you have any questions, again, contact your local sales manager. And if you're not sure who that is, contact me, and I'll put the email in the right direction. But yeah, thank everyone for turning up. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and enjoy your afternoon. And I'll see you again. Bye, everyone.